to the Bureau podcast and a very special sort of belated event here today. Gary Clement needs absolutely no introduction for the Bureau's readers. He's done uncountable, amazing op-eds for the Bureau, talking about the problems that face Canada and talking about his book about the Chinese Communist Party's forward operational base on PEI, which is another story and podcast. We're going to talk today about Ryan Wedding, because I think we both agree Ryan Wedding is the story of the former Olympian that should get it through to the Canadian mainstream that Canada is not the Canada that they once believed in. It's become something different. And Gary has re-edited or rewritten his great book called Undercover about his career investigating what I would call the domestic precursors of Ryan Weddings. That's the outlaw bikers that have been strong in Canada for decades, and how we both agree they've been taken over by the Chinese Communist Party, the Mexican cartels, and Iranian networks. So Gary, first, you don't need an introduction, but introduce yourself and tell us why you're bringing back out a new edition of Undercover. Your career in the RCMP.
Thanks very much for having me, Sam, and thank you for allowing me to write some of the op-eds. I'd rather be sitting here and saying we don't have to do this, but I really think the Canadian public needs to be educated. What we're dealing with, I believe, has serious consequences for this country. I believe it's having an impact. And since I put my first book out, I think for the most part it fell on deaf ears, notwithstanding the fact it virtually sold out. But the bottom line is I don't think, and I know that's the reason you haven't given up, we've got to get this out because what we're facing is a convergence of organized crime, foreign influence, and illicit finance. And it's threatening, I believe, our national sovereignty. And that's what we've got to do. We've become one of the world's safest havens for dirty money. And I'm not proud of that. I believe that, in the 70s and 80s, I think we were at least, somewhat controlling it. But I think we have to agree it's rampant right now. We're seeing influence from the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. We're seeing heavy influence by the Chinese Communist Party through the United Front. And, people like Ryan Wedding, we were open for business. The sad part, and I've been asked this question many times, what's the chances today of being a major trafficker involved with some of these organizations, of being caught? And I'm talking in Canada, not United States. I'm talking in Canada. And, the reality of it is pretty slim. And if you do get caught, what's the consequences? And those things all factor into why we're saying I think we're a safe haven. There's just no punishment in this country. Our Charter of Rights and our cases like Jordan, Stinchcombe, really fly in the face of doing major transnational organized crime investigations. And when those two when the Supreme Court ruled in those, we weren't dealing with what we're dealing with today. And justice hasn't kept up. They haven't built up to be able to take this stuff on. The RCMP, sadly, is no longer fit for purpose. So I just think it's important. We got to get this message out. And hopefully it starts to resonate with Parliament. Because if not, I think, as I said on one interview I did, what's Canada going to look like in 50 years if we continue on the path we're on? And that's kind of, for me, I know I won't be here, but I'd like to say I tried to contribute to change that narrative, because if we let things continue to go, elections are going to be won based on the influence of outside government agencies.
Yeah, and I would say already we're pretty close to having the fear that fair and free elections really aren't guaranteed in Canada and may already have been overturned. We'll leave that aside, but from floor crossings to election interference, it's pretty clear that China is very deep into our systems. We can talk more about that, but
Yeah.
before we get into Ryan Wedding, the modern day Canada-based Sinaloa cartel kingpin, and how could that happen in Canada? Let's talk a little bit about your book, which covers how you got into really deep policing through undercover work. So tell us just a little bit about that personally before we talk, and then I'll let the listeners know we're going to get into you're experiencing the leaders of Chinese organized crime and intelligence in Hong Kong. But first, your undercover career.
Yeah, well, I went into undercover because it was a fast track into getting into plain clothes. I was stationed in British Columbia, and the rule of thumb back in the day I joined was you would have to do about 8 years in uniform before you could ever get into plain clothes. And I had set a goal right from day one. I wanted to get into narcotics investigations. And so the fast track was getting into undercover. And I believed at that time it was probably the best vehicle we had to get into organized crime. And I watched a lot of journalistic shows and saw how journalists were able to get themselves in front of organized crime figures using various facades. And I went, great, we got all the information, we got all the intelligence. Why can't we do that? So, I mean, one of the things I set out to do, I did a lot of cold approaches, which, I used to argue, what's the worst could happen? It's a yes or a no.
Mm.
And because we get all the intelligence, you can raise the possibility of getting in front of them and have them accepted a lot easier than should be able to, than a lot easier than a journalist. And so that was the approach I took. And I think going in with that made me somewhat successful, especially with the teams that backed me up. So it did. It got me in front of a lot of organized crime figures. And as a result of that, I think I had an understanding very quickly of how organized crime operated because you see it firsthand. And being able to see it firsthand, I think, makes you a far more competent investigator. So that's the reason I did it. I was very fortunate especially the Vancouver undercover operation, to get into at that time, some of the highest levels of organized crime in the province, tied back to Montreal. And it was interesting times. China surfaced at that time, and I found this always very interesting. Is I had an individual that wanted to get me some Chinese heroin. And his statement was, well, the police had shut down the Chinese gambling dens, so there was no debts outstanding. So they were sitting on the heroin because nobody had to sell it off to pay their debts. And I thought that was really interesting. Now, and we're talking back in the 70s on that. So heroin was quite alive and well from the Chinese organized crime groups back in the 70s.
So that's interesting. It's almost like the very early days of the Vancouver model. So using gambling debts as a way to, cycle the drug money, repay it in various areas. You were already
Correct.
seeing that. And then of course, in 2015, 2016, I revealed sort of how it exploded in BC
Loaded.
government casinos. So yeah, that takes us. You had seen early days of Chinese organized crime in Vancouver. So jump us over to Hong Kong in the early 90s. And I'm just going to frame this by saying, I know you have some very serious files on the Vancouver ports and the business and political networks that you looked into in the 90s. We'll talk a little bit about that as much as you can. But in Hong Kong, no one listening to this should get it confused. You, along with Hong Kong Royal Police, Western intelligence, were encountering the absolute top level leadership of Chinese transnational crime. So Stanley Ho, someone that has come up in the Jeffrey Epstein files, none other than Jeffrey Epstein calls Stanley Ho, who is deceased. Apologies to his family if they're offended, but Jeffrey Epstein called him the boss of the Chinese mob. So this is a person, and I know you'll tell us more, that was very deeply invested across Canada in real estate, very politically connected in Canada. And just tell us a little bit about, what you know about Stanley Ho from your files, and maybe I'll name a few other figures. But Hong Kong, what was going on?
Well, it's interesting with Stanley Ho. I mean, one of the things I found really interesting was his secretary, who was a male, was murdered. And this before I got there. It was probably in the late mid 70s, from my understanding. And what happened, what I found really fascinating, talking to a number of sources in the Royal Hong Kong Police that worked in the Triad Bureau, the once he was murdered, they launched an investigation, and the management of the Royal Hong Kong Police pulled an inspector in training that had just come over from the UK and assigned him responsibility to investigate that and put a restriction on it that he could not interview Stanley Ho. Well, anybody's going to do an investigation right off the bat and do it thoroughly. You want to put especially when you're talking Stanley Ho, you want to put a competent, seasoned investigative team on that. And you definitely don't want to take a restriction out that you can't interview Stanley Ho. And so I found that really fascinating. And I got told many times that Stanley Ho was heavily influenced the 14K Triad Society. I drew an analogy from a contact I had in Macau that he was ahead of it. I mean, whether you can establish that for sure, but he definitely was heavily involved. I think what was even more interesting, I had an opportunity myself to interview Stanley Ho, and I got shut down by the head of mission, and I was forbidden from interviewing Stanley Ho, which I found really interesting. And then I found out shortly thereafter that he got a passport. I call it a passport of convenience for Canada. And I mean, yeah, he had lots of money, and he's living proof that he bought a Canadian passport. Period.
Right. So what you hint towards there is there yourself and Brian McAdam, the immigration
Correct.
control officer that you worked with, had the plausible suspicion that some officials in Canada's consulate or mission apparatus and immigration system in Hong Kong could have been receiving, complimentary red envelopes of cash or some sort of bribery at a larger scale.
Well, there's no doubt they did. I went to a horse race. We were all invited out by the mission, and we went to this horse race, and then we're all handed these red envelopes containing cash to gamble for the day. And I didn't use mine. I didn't accept it. I mean, because as far as I was concerned, that's a bribe.
Mm-hmm.
You don't. I learned something from a gentleman who was a Canadian, already had a Canadian passport. He had already invested in Canada, but he lived in Hong Kong. Very well respected, a guy by the name of Lo Yuk Lun. And YL Lo was probably at that time around 60. And I got to meet him. I had helped him out on something that I would have helped anybody, so it wasn't like it was for anything special. But anyways, we struck up a relationship. And YL, one of the meetings I had with him, said to me, Gary, understand this. Nobody does anything for nothing. And in the Chinese culture, that is even more serious. So if you take something, expect you're going to have to repay it. And I thought that was very interesting. And he had insinuated at that time that there was a lot in the Canadian mission that hadn't learned that. So I thought that was very interesting.
Right. There's an unwritten contract or guanxi, if Canadians could
Exactly.
learn that in one way or another, if you took something, even a favor, not money, they're going to find a way to get that back out of you,
Precisely.
which
And
could include compromat. If you don't want to give something back, then you will it'll let be known that some information could come out, right?
precisely. And, that it's unfortunate because Brian, more so than myself, as you well know, got ostracized very badly. I guess I stood up. I was probably because of my position and my rank that I had, I was able to fend it off a lot easier than Brian was. But without a doubt, I never saw anybody get sidelined and ostracized like him. I think it's the worst I've seen in my entire lifetime. I mean, the guy was abused, and the government owes him a debt of gratitude rather than what they did to him.
Yeah, and that had its medical effect on his early death and suffering, no doubt.
Yeah, without a doubt, it did. Brian, unfortunately, Brian took it to heart, wasn't able to fight back. I guess that's where he and I differ in a lot of respect. I was damned if I was going to give in to them, so that was the end of that story.
Well, some people can more easily kind of say, without swearing here, whatever criticism you're giving me, I don't care because I know what I am and I know what you are. And
Yeah,
I think Brian wasn't quite, we'll leave that aside. A wonderful
yeah,
man,
exactly.
wonderful Canadian. So let me ask you this. You read all my writing. I read all your writing. I edit some of your writing. I've said that Li Ka-shing and his entities being kicked out of the Panama Canal, which is now done. The Panama Supreme Court has, for whatever reason, ruled that it was unconstitutional to give Li Ka-shing and his entities access, which of course is why Marco Rubio said we won't let Chinese proxies to control that chokehold. But you came across Li Ka-shing very, very directly in your investigations in Hong Kong and Vancouver and the Port of Vancouver.
Correct.
And I know you'll tell us as much as you can about what you think about Li Ka-shing. So I want to tell listeners again, you're getting the history that's happening in the world right now, which relates to geopolitics and a spreading war. Gary Clement investigated the very front wave of this with people like Stanley Ho and Li Ka-shing. So Li Ka-shing, what can you tell us?
Well, it's interesting. He is another one of these rags to riches stories. If you go back on his history and you look at him, he was rags to riches. And all of a sudden, he just, he comes up and gets involved in a lot of companies with a lot of people that have links to triads. He claims he is not triad, but my argument is, and what I got from Royal Hong Kong Police, you just can't be on, you're either in or you're out. So I would say in his case, he was in. His development in Canada, again, was another case of buying a passport, in my view. The government of Canada saw this as great opportunity for investment in our country because they had billions at their disposal. But they didn't look at what the underlying factors were, how they were tied. All of these ended up being tied very tightly to the PRC government. And as a result, they ended up being probably some of the richest proxies that we allowed in this country for China.
And so directly to, I know you also have deep files on Vancouver's port and certain investigations in the early 90s where I think I can say you were looking into what would appear to be, legitimate, long-standing business persons. I'm talking about investment firms, mall owners, travel agencies across Western Canada and Toronto, and port access in Vancouver. So what can you say about that?
Well, sadly, we got rid of, as you know, port police, or the RCMP quit investigating in the I would say early 80s. We got out of it. Biggest mistake that Canada could have ever made. And then the Surrey Fraser docks, we allowed Chinese interest entities under the auspices of Hong Kong to go into these ports. I wrote at that time that as a result of that, Vancouver would displace Hong Kong as a transshipment point for narcotics. It has surpassed that in spades. Vancouver, in my view, is ground zero for all of this. You control the ports, you control what goes in and out. And if you look at the Montreal port, it was controlled by bikers for years. You look at Vancouver ports, it's totally controlled by criminal activity. So if you look at the facts, we have 500,000 vehicles stolen in this country. We have 40 billion in illegal drugs. We got 40,000 overdose deaths, 38,000 human trafficking victims, and 600 billion in financial suspicious transactions. that's all because we didn't take appropriate action in the early 80s. We allowed it to get away from us. And as a result, we're in the mess that we're in today.
Right. So we've laid the groundwork. I did a more recent story for the Bureau calling Vancouver essentially a forward operational base for the CCP, the
Yeah.
Mexican cartels, and the Iranian money launderers and sophisticated encryption technology.
Yeah.
You could say, you could make the argument that everything from reconnaissance to laying money laundering and espionage funding networks throughout Vancouver was done over the course of decades. So let's talk about the one piece before we get into Ryan Wedding, who's a main topic for this conversation: Iranian currency traders. And of course, this has huge geopolitical relevance to the war in Iran right now. We know, as I've written for the Bureau, that Iranian Guard and Hezbollah criminal sleeper cells look like they're already active in Canada, shooting up certain, synagogues and businesses of an Iranian dissident, it appears. But you look deeply into the Iranian currency traders. You've had various insights after leaving policing. You've read my reporting in Toronto, Ortis case. So tell us about that whole system and what it means.
Well, I was fortunate, or pending when I ran my company, that I got involved with the some Iranian MSBs, the legitimate ones, I should say,
Mm-hmm.
because there's a lot that are not.
Yeah.
And in fact, I did submit a couple intelligence briefs, both the FinTrack and the RCMP on it, of all the unregistered ones. And because I ingratiated myself and actually became friends of a couple of the individuals that ran them, um, they supplied me with a lot of intelligence, what was going on in the Iranian community. And I can remember walking down Young Street in North Young Street, north of the 401, and we were walking down, and a couple gentlemen were pointing out all of these illegal traders that were existing, talking about how they were tied right back to the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, how they had machines in their able to transfer money directly into the banks in Iran or get money back, and how it was just falling on blind eyes and deaf ears as far as the enforcement community. Um, you know, what I learned is that the amount of individuals that were tied to the Iranian Revolutionary Guard really, and that, we're talking now in the 90s, really surprised me that we were doing nothing about it. As you know, we don't in this country, our lax immigration laws, and some of which had been ordered removed from the country, but at that time had not yet been removed. And, I looked at it at that time and started, I guess that's why I'm still wrote a second edition of my book. I see all this stuff happening. And I wonder, when are we going to wake up? Because exactly what you said, it was bound to catch up with us. You can take it to the bank here. We're going to see more, I think, terrorist type attacks by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. Um, they exist in this country. We do not have a handle on them. And because we don't have a handle on them, I think we're in deep trouble when something like this breaks out around the world. And those are the concerns we should have. And then you extrapolate that and look at how are we going to be perceived by the United States if we keep this up. And I know we'll get into it later, but especially now that our prime minister is walking back his support for what's going on. What's that saying to these Iranian Revolutionary Guard that are in this country? What's it saying to all the other proxies, China, et cetera, et cetera? And what does that mean for Canada and potentially United States? Do these people end up going into the States and taking action? If so, where's that leave Canada?
That's a great point, and I'll pivot on your frame there because, yeah, if we bring Prime Minister Carney's walk back into the picture, and I just want to paint the geolocation for the listeners and viewers, what you described walking through all those currency traders that your sources, who are Iranian currency traders linked to the Iranian Guards. This is an area of North Toronto, North York, Willowdale, Thornhill, where over the past week. An Iranian boxer who is on the side of the dissidents had his gym shot up. Uh,
Correct.
the Emmanuel Synagogue, where luminaries such as David Frum have said they used to attend, again, apparently shot up by a high powered weapon. So, this is the area where you're saying, and I'm saying, one of the epicenters of Iranian Guard money laundering in North America, perhaps along with Vancouver, the top one. Maybe we'll put LA in there as well.
Correct.
The area you're talking about is where these shootings were. And I'll add this on the Kearney point, a very politically connected alleged human trafficker who I'm not going to name in this conversation, who came up in the Cameron Ortis case. Cameron Ortis, the former RCMP intelligence boss, was selling US government targeting plans to this man who later came up in, FBI investigations for Iranian Guard or Hezbollah oil trading, who's a major money launderer in Toronto, which the Ortis case itself said was laundering. This one guy, who I'm not going to name, was laundering billions through Canadian big banks. So I'll throw it back to you. I think together we both painted the picture of North Toronto being an absolute espionage and organized crime hotspot for the very same regime that's now targeted in the Middle East by the most powerful entity in the world, the US military.
Yeah, I agree. It's unfortunate, but that's true. But we've turned a blind eye for so long. Traditional organized crime has operated in North Toronto for years, and again, it's surfaced in investigation that occurred in Italy. It's never ever ended up back on Canadian soil, and you have to ask, why is that? Are we really, as a country, that inept at taking on organized crime? I don't believe that. I think we've got um, a lot of qualified investigators and prosecutors out there. I believe that our government still has its head in the sand. Unfortunately, I think our government is being filled by far too many people that are aligned outside of what would be Canadian values, and that's starting to really impact us. We really need to get a handle back on this. If we had effective enforcement, effective intelligence, an effective justice system, people like Ryan Wedding would have never got to grow as much as he did.
Right. Perfect pivot. So let me ask you this, or frame it like this. I've seen the pictures as I gather more on Ryan Wedding of his high school days in Coquitlam, and I believe he was already sort of associated with a junior hockey player from the Alberta region who ended up being part of his Canada Sinaloa branch. But look, this is a massively talented, massively focused and tactical young Canadian. Obviously, as he was rising to be an Olympic athlete, he already, it appears, was probably dallying a little bit in sort of the marijuana culture. He had, sort of hyper built, modified cars. He was already interested in that way back in his BC high school days. I've seen the evidence. And so now that we've painted a little bit of a picture and a map of Canada, knowing what you've read from me and others, how do you see Ryan Wedding rising in the structure, in Canada, and then, becoming a senior player for Mexico?
Well, I think what ends up happening is if you were to go back on Ryan Wedding, I mean, there's all kinds of indications he was dabbling in marijuana. And if we look at it, marijuana, Vancouver, British Columbia was the sort of marijuana capital, I believe, of North America is the only way to describe it.
Mm-hmm.
So he was dabbling in it. If you were to look at the effectiveness of enforcement at that time, subpar, I think we have to agree. So individuals, probably stood less than a 3% chance of even getting arrested. And if they did, it was a slap in the wrist. So all of a sudden you got individuals, especially individual like Ryan Wedding, that's got an ego that wouldn't fit probably in all of Ottawa.
Yeah.
And so, he's out there, he starts dabbling in this stuff. He's making far more money than he ever thought he would. Nobody's he isn't looking over his shoulder to any great extent. And it allows him the opportunity to branch out And that's where he gets into cocaine and that, because as he's moving marijuana, and he started moving, I believe he was moving in the US as well. And that's where he started to make his contacts. Then he goes to prison. He wasn't in prison very long, but he got his master's in drug trafficking in the short time he was in prison, made all kinds of contacts. I'm sure he's still in there with his ego saying, well, you can't get caught in Canada, et cetera, et cetera. And that's how it starts to explode. And he starts to draw in more and more people into his organization. And as his empire grows and he gets more infiltrated in the various organizations, he also becomes more violent because he needs to protect himself and the organization. And he loses all sense of value of life and everything. And that's where he is today. He ended up being this tied to, he had to be in front of the Sinaloa cartel. He had to be seen as somebody as ruthless as they are, or they would have never accepted him. So that's how he had managed to get where he ended up. I think also what bothers me is, as I said, you nip these people quickly when they first start out. They don't grow that big. By doing nothing, they're able to grow. And he's just one example. There's others as well in this country.
Right. And I know we're neither of us psychologists, but you being an former undercover, you certainly got you taught yourself the psychology of humans, and you had to survive in that world. You learned the psychology of criminals, face to face. That was what allowed you to infiltrate and learn. So let me put it to you this way. I mean, I've pondered the thought. I mean, like, if we look at a Lance Armstrong, who is not a narcotics person in any way, but was perhaps the best in the world at what he did, but realized to keep it going, he would have to get into some sort of criminality. When we read about an Armstrong, there's an athletic mind that is so absolutely focused and tactful and strategic that if it became criminal, that level of athlete, you could be very good. So do you apply that kind of thinking to Ryan Wedding at all?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you look at Olympians today and what they have to go through and the dedication and commitment to their training. Also, look at their psyche and how they operate. One of the things I use as a great example, the last three Olympics, they have made a point of coming out and saying that the amount of prophylactics have been used up and they ran out after about 3 days.
Yeah.
That has to tell you something about their drive and their motivation. And I'm just saying it all goes hand in hand. And so, yeah, you get into the drug world with that same commitment and dedication. Yeah, you got a vehicle or a wrecking ball to deal with. It's the only way to describe it.
I mean, that's a good point that I've never really thought of. Like all these narcos, like they don't
Yeah,
spend their night off studying. They're in the nightclub. They're out. A lot of them are out showing off their cars, and part of it
exactly.
is related to that more carnal drive that the Olympians seem to be displaying as well.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because it does, you can, a lot of drug traffickers are entrepreneurial. Most of them are there, but you can separate the wheat from the chaff real quick. The ones that are going to rise up, and it's amazing. And I go back to I guess analogy. There was one time I bought way back in the 70s 3 kilos of cocaine off this young girl, and I mean, we knew her brothers were connected to the bikers, etc. But the bottom line was, here was this young girl that was supposedly sang in a choir, which she did because I had to reschedule some appointments because she was singing in a church choir. And but her ego, what she wanted to accomplish in her drive was absolutely scary.
Hmm.
And, I mean, here was a girl that ended up driving up in her own car with 3 kilos of cocaine. Now, back in the 70s, that was a lot of drugs
Hmm.
on her front seat of her car and no protection. And that's how these people that are really egotistical believe they're untouchable. That's how they operate. And Ryan Wedding was magnify that by 1,000, and that's what you got in a Ryan Wedding.
Yeah, it reminds me, I don't know if I was interviewing a criminologist somewhere in my 20-year career, or no, I think it might have came from an RCMP lawyer who was looking at an RCMP guy that went wrong. And I think he said, looking at the criminal mind, often you could have a sociopath who never was corrected in their younger years, never really, they always pushed the boundaries, but they never really ran into the wall. Somehow they escaped it, and that they go off on that path.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that, and you've brought up about some of the corruption that's existed in policing. We just saw it in Toronto.
Hmm.
In my career, I worked with the infamous Patrick Ryan Kelly. He was got tied into the Colombian organized crime cocaine cartel way back in the 70s. And then I worked and I was around when Claude Savoie, who's a superintendent that got tied into the West End gang and was found, he ended up committing suicide, unfortunately, but he got tied into the West End gang. And that was the reason for years the RCMP could never uh, prosecute the West End gang because Claude was on the inside. I believe the way that we're looking at China, the way we're looking at the Iranian community, I think we're a lot of government departments and a lot of police departments are potentially infiltrated because they set their goal on doing this, and I'm not sure we got a vetting process sufficient enough to prevent that. And I think what we've been seeing, we're going to see more of in the years to come.
Yeah, so let's this is something that came up in the Cameron Ortis case. Of course, his defense, and he's coming up for appeal again, we should mention, was it was absurd. He argued that he was running a one-man intelligence operation over and above everyone else in Canada to inform, our allies. He was running an operation for our allies, a sting operation. This was his absurd tale of why he was sharing certain documents with criminals. But something I believe truthful that he said was that, he's facing allegations, but he was aware of deep penetration across the RCMP, deep penetration into the Toronto Police Services and others. And he said he said a quote that stuck with me. He said that the Iranian criminal that he's accused of sharing intelligence with, who I'm not going to name, had exquisite visibility into different departments. And I think he was accurate in that. So this process of officers across departments entering police databases called CPIC and sharing sensitive personal information and intelligence back to organized criminals, I have the feeling and sense that that's pretty broad across Canada. So what would you think about that? I mean, you've been outside for a while, but do you think that's plausible?
Well, I think it's plausible. A good example is when I did the Larry Miller organized crime undercover investigation. One of the ways I got in was saying that I had contacts within police departments, both in Canada and the United States, and I get information. And we orchestrated because we were working with IRS as well at the time. I was able to get a bogus document, looked like an IRS document, to show Larry Miller. That was Miller was, oh, well, I've got contacts too, but it's really great to see you've got contacts. So we've known that's gone on for ages. We know it's happened within Canada Border Services, where those on the border will look the other way when certain trucks go through. That's happened. We know it's China, the PRC. I should make sure people understand that. One of the things they want to do is infiltrate both law enforcement, government offices, and we know that's gone on. Motor vehicle branch has been infiltrated. That was very clear on some of the licenses being given out for the big truck drivers or the large truck drivers, so your Class A license. So these things have been going on and are happening. I've always said, I mean, corruption exists. We have to accept that. And the only way you prevent corruption is that you make sure you got the safeguards in place and that you're willing to look at it when there's a bit of smoke rather than waiting till it's too late. And unfortunately, in this country, for a lot of reasons, I mean, the blue wall in policing prevents, I think, a lot of early on investigations. You get it, whether it be in the parliamentarians, we've got 13 liberals that have been had ethics violations. And they're looked at as minor ethics violations, but if you really dig down on them, some of them are really serious. And are they borderline criminal? I would say yes, and probably should be looked at as such. But the more you allow that to seep in, the more you turn a blind eye, I think the greater propensity there is to have it happen.
Right. I want to dig a little further into your thoughts on the Toronto Police Services scandal. I mean, just to recount the allegations, a number of officers allegedly assisted in narcotics investigations for what the York Regional Police say a very seriously internationally connected suspect in Toronto. I took that to mean connected to Latin cartels based on sort of the typologies revealed in the case. So, marijuana going out, cocaine and meth coming back in, fentanyl going over to Europe. All the hallmarks you and I know of serious transnational crime and Latin cartels that have infiltrated our biker networks and people like Ryan Wedding. The last thing I'd add is the Wedding indictment already says that, the Wedding through a Toronto lawyer had accessed Ontario police investigations into a murder. The U.S. indictment says that lawyer was responsible for bribery in Canada for the Wedding network, which I extrapolate could include bribery of law enforcement or above. We don't know right now. So when you look at the Toronto Police Services case, it looks like a jail warden targeted for murder because the jail warden was good at blocking drugs coming in. Do you think it could speak to Wedding himself or Latin cartel networks?
Well, it definitely could speak to that. I mean, what I guess disturbs me about that is the numbers that were involved. And I'll go a step further. What really bothers me, and I can use an example where we did an investigation on a couple officers, senior officers here in Ottawa Police, back when I was still with the RCMP. And what really amazed me is that when we started the investigation, this was well known, and I would dare say probably up to and including the chief. Nobody did want to do anything about it. The organized criminal was able to operate with virtual impunity for decades. And I sat there and it amazed me because after I had worked with Pat Kelly he was my partner when I was under, I took the approach that I'd rather take down a dirty cop than 3 criminals because that dirty cop can just impact everything. Mm-hmm. And that was a philosophy I took throughout the rest of my career. Unfortunately, that is not the case for most. And I really saw when, I guess what bothers me is how far a police association will go to defend members. And I believe 100% in the defense of a member, and if they're carrying out their duties, I think they deserve a full and frank defense. But if you're doing something as breaking the law, why are we defending them? It flies in the face. It tarnishes us all. And that's my argument. So when I see this, I have to ask the question, how many people in the department were aware something was not right? And how many turned a blind eye because it would be a violation of the blue wall? And that bothers me, to think that we've transcended ourselves. I say ourselves because I was a policeman for 34 years, but we've lowered ourselves to that standard. That's how things get out of control. I think that it tarnishes our badge for everybody. And I think officers at all stripes have to stand up. So do I think it's going on in departments? Absolutely. And it will continue to go on until people realize that we can't allow it to happen because it's organized crime that's winning. And then they've got to look at what are the consequences. Well, the consequences are overdose, human trafficking? And are we willing to say that we're part and parcel of that?
Yeah, that brings me to a question and maybe something you could frame for the average Canadian. I mean, they'll listen to us, they'll read some of the stories, and I'm imagining that they might think, well, life goes on. Life's not that bad in Canada. But you and I are saying that organized crime has gotten very deep into our systems. And we've said Ryan Wedding, former Olympian, now being cited as someone on, Escobar or El Chapo level, whether true or not, he's up there. So that should be a sign. But what are some of the other signs that you as an expert could tell Canadians, to use your own eyes, see what's going on around that may be organized crime, or that may be Canada sort of spiraling out of control?
Well, I think of the average Canadian, and I go back to when I used to do some public talks on this way back in the 70s and 80s. Um, we all know, and unfortunately, and I'm going to throw this out, unfortunately, our legal profession still has not been brought in under the Proceeds of Crime and Money Laundering Act. I think that is a huge gap. Yeah, I love the fact that the defense counsel will all say, oh, no, but we're officers of the court. We do everything right. Well, that's like saying all police officers, we're under the badge. We do everything right. We all know that doesn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't happen with lawyers. And we got all kinds of cases, more so than ever, of lawyers that are in the pocket of organized crime. I can go back and look at some of the traditional organized crime groups and look at their org chart. I can remember one I looked at, and there was two. I don't know if they were son-in-laws or sons that had gone into the legal profession, and they were still part of that organized crime group. Well, if we don't put some controls in, we're never, ever going to get a handle on it. So, the other thing is there's a lot of individuals that are out there running around with a fancy car, a big home, boats, et cetera, throw money around. Have you ever stopped to ask yourself, where do they get their money from? Or if they're, constantly out and they got all kinds of young women going in and out of their homes and things like that, it's time to wake up. Also, every organized crime figure, especially Chinese organized crime, they want to get their picture taken with politicians. I wish our politicians would wake up. We've seen it, Sam. We got lots of photos of our prime minister or other ministers being photographed. I can go back to when, at that time, it was Mayor Campbell who became premier of the province of British Columbia, standing with the father of the head of the Sanyan Triad Society, went front page news of South China Morning Post the next morning. I mean, those are the type of things that are occurring. Those are the type of things that we need to wake up to. And they don't do this because they want to be seen as in the hands of the politician. They're doing it because they want to earn credibility so that they can go out in the rest of society and say, oh, well, look, I was with the prime minister. I'm an honest guy, so you should be doing business with me. We need to wake up to this. Companies need to make sure, where is that investment money coming from? I think we have to do a better job of things like that and wake up. Instead of saying, well, I need the money, it's beneficial. What is going to be the long-term impact? And I don't think anybody in this country looks at what the long-term impact is going to be for their children or their children's children. That, for me, is why I'm still doing this. That's why I wrote the second book. I'm hoping that some recognition will exist that we've got to make some changes in this country. We got a great country, but we're not going to be great for long if we keep this up.
Yeah, that brings me to last two questions. Some great op-eds you have written for the Bureau includes questioning Mark Carney's decision to have the RCMP, your former employer, that you have many illuminating experiences with, the RCMP partnering with China's Ministry of Public Security in ways that we don't yet know the extent of, and that was the point of your op-ed. So explain the potential risks that you think exist with such a high-level partnership.
Well, first of all, anything that is coming out of China is done for the benefit of the PRC government. So anything that's going to be asked for the benefit of the PRC government. I remember testifying in an immigration hearing and testifying because the Chinese government, the PRC government, had stated, well, they had statements from this individual and they rhymed them off of all the alleged offenses of this individual. Problem is, you can't believe any of that. There's no rule of law. There's no charter of rights. When they take a statement, they'll go in and basically write it out for them and make them agree to it. And what we're dealing with in this country is, and I was experienced it when China first came over to us. This would have been not long before I finally retired, but I had to meet with some Chinese officials, and they handed me a list of individuals that they wanted us to track down for them. And they were basically economic criminals. Well, no, they had a falling out with the current regime, and that was what their fallout was. And I'm not saying that at some point some of them didn't rip off the government, but unfortunately, you don't know which one is which, and if it's just to silence them or they want to bring them back, they will threaten the family that still remains in China. So yeah, we got to be careful because we end up colluding with them, and it may be detrimental to the remaining family in China. So yeah, it really concerns me. Sharing of intelligence. Would we hand over our stuff to the current Chinese regime? We can't say there's an independence between them and the law enforcement. They're one and the same. They go hand in hand. And everything they're doing right now, China is part of the Belt and Road Initiative. It's all for the benefit of China. What we saw in Prince Edward Island is all for the benefit of the PRC government. And so those are the things that I think Canadians have to understand. We got a great country if we look after. We're going to see, I believe we will see things in this country in the next decade that we had hoped we would never see because of some of the individuals we've let in. You can, go against what Trump has done. The one thing, though, I think he's done right is if you're deemed persona non grata in the country, they're sent out immediately. We've got, I may stand to be correct on this, but I think it was something like 40,000 individuals that have been deemed persona non grata, and we don't know where they are. That's
Yeah.
scary. How many of them are IRG? How many of them are Chinese Communist Party? What does that mean for this country? And, the last thing I want to be is where Canada all of a sudden is accused of a major terrorist attack in the United States, where the individuals all come out of this country. That would be devastating economically for this country.
Yeah, I agree. And another thing that devastating that I've reported on, of course, is the growth of Canada as a fentanyl producer. There's still some controversy on how much of an exporter Canada is, but I frankly think it's a lot of gaslighting from Prime Minister Mark Carney's office that is minimizing how much Canada has become an exporter and how much we're vulnerable to increasingly filling the gap from Mexican-based organized crime to Mexican-connected organized crime in Canada. So what's your take and assessment on, let's put it this way, the inputs of precursors from China coming into Vancouver and Canada, the labs on the ground, and how they're being used in global organized crime?
Look, I've written on this and spoke on it as well, Sam. And I think this uses that we're 1% of the supply. I wish people would wake up. You can't have the amount of precursors that are coming into this country, the amount of organized crime connections that exist in this country, and not recognize that we are a supplier. What that amount is, actually, I don't care. The bottom line is we are a supplier of fentanyl. It takes very little to kill people. So let's accept that we are part of the problem and deal with the problem. Let's not worry about, we're only 1%. I don't see what the value of making that statement is, unless it's, well, we don't really need to beef up federal enforcement because we're only 1%. Because if that's the case, we're a joke and we're only fooling ourselves.
All right. So we've covered a great deal and we're going to have to do this again soon. It took a while. Yeah, again, people, come to the Bureau, especially the paid subscribers. You can read all of Gary's op-eds, and there's many powerful op-eds. So thanks for that, Gary. And tell the listeners and viewers your books and where they can find them.
Yeah, they look the last one, and we haven't done an official launch. We're going to do it in April, but it's Undercover: 50 Years of Dirty Money, Organized Crime in the RCMP. And as I said, what I tried to loop in some of what we've got in this conversation and tie it back to people, so how serious it is. And then we've got the book in British Columbia that I wrote with Michelle Junot Katsuya, and Dean contributed as well. And that's, again, that's to deal with Canada under siege, how Prince Edward Island became a forward operating base. Both are available through Amazon or through Optimum. And for the most part, the feedback has been really good. They really dovetail, I think, nicely into your first book, which I was glad to be able to have many discussions with you on that, because I think they do dovetail. And if you were to take the collection of these books, there is nobody can't say they don't understand how serious this problem is.
Yeah. So before letting you go, the last question I'll ask is, you're the news conference that we both attended in Ottawa regarding your book on Prince Edward Island, and you had stated that it looks to you like the Chinese Communist Party is the largest transnational crime organization in the world, which I myself agree with. Your statements have gone pretty viral. Week after week, people are still posting them to social media. I don't know how many views. Mostly you, I as well. And others. Honorable Wayne Easter. Chris Coates, Dean Baxendale. Everyone had some words to say, and I think tens of thousands, if more, have not seen them. What are your thoughts on that particular press conference and the role of, let's just say, citizens and social media now in getting your message out?
Well, the only thing I'll say is thank God for social media, because, like you used to work for the traditional media. It's I hate to say it, but because of what they get from the government, there's no such thing amongst, now some of them definitely, I don't want to cast them all with the same aspersion, but the vast preponderance have forgot what it is to be an investigative journalist. And so if it wasn't for journalists like yourself and other social media, a story like mine would not be told, because it flies in the face of our government. Obviously, we are critical, and we're trying to get the truth out. And I hope people understand. It's not like we're making money off this, because we're not. I do this because I honestly believe in this country, and people might not buy into that. But at 72 years old, I could be doing a lot of other things besides this.
Yeah.
But I honestly believe that we got to keep plugging away at this until somebody wakes up.
All right, Gary, thanks for this. Thanks for your contributions to the Bureau, and thanks for your service to Canada. And we'll talk again.
Thanks very much, Sam. Have a great day.
You too.